All right, everybody, let's start. Chapter 3, new chapter. Like I said, we just got over who he was from Martinique and how he figured out the black versus white scenario within racism and stuff. So let's talk about what we're gonna do. Chapter 3, all right? Chapter 3, the amnesia of Euro-American psychology. Leaving this Europe, Leaving this Europe, where they are never done talking about men, yet murder everywhere they find them. Look at them today, swaying between atomic and spiritual disintegration. Francis Fanon, Wretch of the Earth. From the 14th century to the present, Europe and its descendants have been embarked on the unprecedented mission of violence and self-aggrandizement throughout the world. Meanwhile, an intellectual debate on the human condition had been raging in academic circles. A discipline called psychology emerged by the 16th century when Philip Melanchthon, a friend of Luther, coined the term, even though the roots of this new disciple reached back to ancient civilization. In time, the new disciple flourished and proliferated in various aspects of society. It developed into its own concept. One numerous adherents, involved its own traditions, won a measure of respectability, and defined a jealousy-girded turf. As Europe conquered much of the world, the European imposing as the only honorable model of humanity, the discipline of psychology to emerged as a powerful specialty and a scientific arbiter of human experience. The discipline of psychology did not, of course, emerge in a social vacuum unrelated to Europe's history of conquest and violence. From its beginning to its presence, the disciplines has been enmeshed in that history of conquest and violence. This fact is all too often unappreciated and conveniently avoided. Yet from a disciple known for its commitment to unmask the repressed and for its profusion of study, such neglect and avoidance of human history and the role of psychologists in that history are curious indeed. The effort of exploring the psychological and oppression requires that we begin by at least stretching the history that determined the nature of social existence and the boundaries of individual biographies and the directions of discipline of psychology took. This chapter examines the history and functions of Euro-American psychology within the context of Europe's assault upon the rest of the world. First, we review Europe's violent rampage throughout the world and the legacy it bequeathed to the discipline of psychology. Such a panoramic review of history is necessary to correct the prevailing amnesia and the common outlook that psychologists have stood apart or acted as neutral agents in the history of oppression. Second, the chapter introduces the nature versus nurture debate that has persisted in psychology. We will see that this debate, seemingly academic and abstract, has always been a crucial implication of social policies and the status quo of oppression. We shall return to this debate in subsequent chapters. Finally, this chapter will outline the ideological and ethnic content of psychology as a background to issues detailed in chapter 4. The violent legacy of Europe. The interdependence of countries and continents is now widely recognized. We know that no continent, no continent can claim true self-sufficiency. This is so in basic commodities, consumer goods, technology, and raw material. A shift in the price of gas, for instance, sets in motion drastic change in the mobility of finances in various communities, large and small. A single political upheaval in one society similarly reverberates in other countries, near and far, Poland, El Salvador, Afghanistan, or in Ogaden, are by no means remote arenas embroiled only in interscene local conflicts. Each is also a pawn to a stubborn superpower conflict that today threatens world peace. This independence in economics and politics also entails an interdependence of psyche. Thus, the global problem of war and peace is not merely a question of armaments or economics, but also a problem of psyche confronting, dominating, and influence each other. More significantly, this global interdependence is based neither on reciprocity nor in equality. It so happens that the wealth of a given set of countries depends on the impoverishment of others. The cultural vigor of some depends on the cultural mummification of others. The brain gain of certain communities depends on the brain drain of others. Moreover, objectification and well-being for some depend on the self-obliteration and torment of others. This non-reciprocal imposed interdependence, in which some gain and others lose, some thrive and others suffer, is not inevitable natural order. Tracing the historical genesis of this oppressive pattern in human relations will take us far beyond our purpose, but we can at least stretch some historical antecedents to today's global oppression. Human oppression has no doubt existed from time immemorial. The exploitation of the weak by the more powerful, the plundering of the poorly equipped by the better equipped, the unjust rule of less organized majority by the more organized minority. In short, oppression in one form or another has had a persistent human reality. Oppression and the revolt it necessarily entails, indeed, constitutes a primary motive force of history. Human oppression predated and engendered the emergence of human consciousness and the civilization. But if oppression was a persistent reality in human existence, its character and dimensions underwent a drastic transformation with the birth of capitalism. The period of 1450 to 1690 is actually a watershed of the history of Europe, and indeed of the world. This period marks the birth of capitalism in the first bourgeois revolution. With the burgeoning of capitalism came drastic changes in the culture production, technical innovation, and migratory patterns of Europe. Feudal Europe, which immensely benefited from culture and scientific contributions of society elsewhere, later imposed its will and greed on these and more distant societies. Thus began the history in which the wealth and development of Europe depended on the ruin of underdevelopment of other societies. The bourgeois revolution in Europe brought about unprecedented change in almost all aspects of life. It undermined the feudal order and dominance of the Catholicism. It represented a definite break with the past. At the same time, Europe benefited immensely from the contributions of other eras and non-European societies. With the demise of Hellenic and Roman civilization, the heritage of Greece returned to non-European societies, whence it had come. Science and culture advanced in Syria, Persia, and China. These advancements were later brought to brilliant synthesis under Islam. The Crusaders of the 12th and 13th centuries brought back much of these cultures and scientific advancements to Europe, which had stagnated throughout the Middle Ages, roughly from the late 15th century to about 1350. Innovation like the horse collar, the clock, the compass, gunpowder paper, and printing all originated in non-European societies, transformed Europe's feudal economy and culture. The contribution of these non-European society to mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and geography formed the backbone of European Renaissance. The perfection of the number system with place notation and zero first developed in India and refined by the followers of Islam, simplified computation and made it accessible to the Europeans, adult and child alike. Non-European scientists under the banner of Islam studied eye disease more prevalent in desert and tropical lands, and subsequently improved surgical eye treatments and introduced modern optics. 1. The lens of the eye they studied suggested the ideal of crystal and glass lenses, and later the telescope. As these contributions extended human sensory apparatus and improved instruments of navigation, reports from Muslim travelers in India, China, Africa, and Russia broadened Europe's narrow conception of the world. These scientific contributions, the revival of classical culture during the Renaissance, and improved navigation opened new vistas in European outlook and commerce. There was a boom in agriculture. Land and sea travel became safer and more profitable. City and town merchants took on increasing significance in European societies. The social relations previously based on fixed hereditary status were gradually replaced by those based on buying as well as selling commodities and labor. By the 15th century, money payments became a dominant means of commodity exchange. As the urban middle class gained ascendancy, first in Holland, then in England, money and profit became the measure of all human values. Religion, science, law, and culture served to justify, stimulate, and protect the new greed for money and profit. The belief took hold that salvation itself lies in more profit and the accumulation of wealth. What matters was not how one became rich, but rather the fact that one was rich. The old hopes of reconciling man with the world were replaced by the determinations to control nature through knowledge of scientific laws. Building ships and commerce boomed. A new quantitative, atomic, and experimental approach to science also emerged. Wealth brought political power to the bourgeoisie. Feudal fetters and old barons, hindering get-rich-quick schemes, gave way through political upheaval to the new political order. As paid soldiers replaced the system of feudal levies, war of expansion and the exercise of might took on a permanent character. The greed for raw materials, new markets, and new wealth intensified. Improvement in metallurgical procedures, a more sophisticated use of gunpowder, and a more efficient distillation of strong spirits soon provided an effective arsenal for conquest abroad. Christianity and its proselytization to offered rationalization to numb both the conscience of the predators and the conscience of the victims. Europe's relation to the rest of the world drastically changed. Slowly but surely, Europe envied assimilation of the scientific and cultural advances of other societies, shifted to a consuming ambition to obtain their lands, labor, and psyches. By 1492, when Columbus discovered quote-unquote America, Spain and Portugal were two sea powers of Europe. Portugal initiated Europeans' international expansion, but England, France, and Holland soon joined in the rampage to share the loot. The cultivation of sugar, tobacco, and cotton required intensive labor. When white indentured servants and convicts could not meet the demand, Native Americans became the target and victims of slavery. Indeed, Wall Street and New York, and noted centers of capital speculation, gets its name from the wall built by the Dutch to separate Native American slaves from their relatives. Thus, in economics, as in psychology, the past remarkably serves as in the present. Moreover, the ruthless ways in which gunpowder, alcohol, and religion were employed to subjugate Native Americans is now a legend. Alcoholism to this day remains the #1 health and social problem among the Native American survivors, who are left stranded on reservations or in urban centers, ostensibly denied them there are gainful employment, cultural moorings, and spiritual anchors in their own land, equally appalling to their rates of suicide. It is as if the survivors of G-side, having exhausted all means of self-defense, hastened their ordained extinction. When Native American slaves could not survive excessive labor, insufficient nutrition, and the white man's venereal diseases, Europe turned to Africa for slaves. That Christianity was once again used to buttress arguments for slavery is hardly surprising. Bartolomeo de la Casa, later the Bishop of Chiapa in Mexico, appealed to Charles V and argued that importing of African slaves was humane, productive, and consistent with Christian doctrine. The king was convinced by both practical consideration of religious justification. African slavery thus began in earnest and brought immense profit and suffering. The slave trade proper began in 1518 to continue as late as 1880. The greed for capital and the African slave trade had further reduced all human values to those of profit and loss. Quote, a black man was worth exactly what his flesh would bring to the market, end quote. When John Hawkins came back to England with a handsome profit made by capturing and selling African slaves, Queen Elizabeth I quickly set aside her moral disgust with slavery and became a shareholder in Hawkins' subsequent voyages. What is more, she provided Hawkins with a ship called Jesus. Even though the psychological impact of the slave trade upon Europeans and their descendants is yet to be assuaged, we know more about the significant contributions of the trade of the Industrial Revolution in his classical books, Capitalism and Slavery. Eric Williams, 1966, documented how the African slave trade financed the Industrial Revolution and made enormous profit from banking concerns, as well as insurance companies. Bristol, Liverpool, Manchester, Bordeaux, and Nantes developed as manufacturing centers because of the slave trade. Shipbuilding and manufacturing of cotton goods, sugar refining, rum distillation, and productions of chain and padlocks, and manufacturing of guns. These were important features of the triangular trade among these centers of trade and industry. We know, for instance, that James Watt's first steam engine was subsidized with profit from the slave trade. Britain's Great Western Railroad was built and funded from the same source. The Barclays and Lloyds, they're both banks, now owners of some of the world's largest banking and insurance concerns, made their initial capital from slave trade. An early historian of Bristol wrote, quote, there's not a brick in the city, but what is cemented with blood of a slave, end quote. A contemporary economist of his whom was writing on the unfolding Industrial Revolution also described the slave trade, quote, as the first principle and foundation of all the rest, mainspring of the machines which set every wheel in motion. If the impact of these predations of Euro-American psyches is unexplored, the masses hemorrhage inflicted on people of color as well as documented. The infamy of slavery and the carnage of the Middle Passage is a legacy of Europe that to this day remains sedimented in the economics, social formations, and psyche of Black people. People of color still reel from the hemorrhage and from its second occurrence of colonialism. The Atlantic slave trade represents the largest and most callous mass immigration imposed upon a people anywhere in the world. Estimates of Africans forced to be a commodity of the Atlantic slave trade range from 15 to 20 million. Recent writers agree that this is a conservative estimate. Some writers now estimate that somewhere between 60 to 150 million Africans were directly involved. African population in 1650 was 21.2% of the world's population. It was mere 7.7% by 1920. In contrast, European populations grew only by 3% between 1650 to 1750. This rose 400% by 1900. By then, Europe's population spilled over to the rest of the world, with 1 million immigrants a year to other continents. The decline of the African population, the rise of the European population, amplified a simultaneous depletion of African resources, human or material, and the socio-economic and cultural development of Europe. Great African empires like Ghana, Mali, and Songhai were disintegrating as European states were growing. The recorded history of Ghana goes back to the 5th century AD. Ghana reached its peak between the 19th and the 11th century. Mali in the 13th and 14th century. Williams, 1976, historian recognizes the high level of culture, the mining of gold and iron, the commerce of the learning elaborated in these and other African empires. The slave trade and later colonialism prevented the development of indigenous states, technology, and centers of learning. African culture was stripped of its creative reservoir, and African art hauled to museum abroad. When the African slave trade ended, Chinese and East Indian workers, people from India, were brought to the Americas to work on the plantations, build railroads, and join a long chain of victims in the diaspora. The kidnapping and selling of African slaves were replaced with colonialism. The traditions from slavery to colonialism had many causes. The demise of an outright slavery was brought on by fears of slave rebellion, heightened by sporadic revolts, worries about growing slave population that might overwhelm the, quote, master race, the concerns about the plight of white soldiers enslaving ships. But the most important factor was that the innovation and the expansion of industrial capitalism imposed new requirements in production, social relations, and markets. The slave trade that provided New England, Lancaster, and the English Midlands with much of their capital from the Industrial Revolution surely should not be given up until a more effective and acceptable alternative to slavery loomed on the horizon. Thus, when the era of colonialism, the gunboat diplomacy began, Euro-Americans readily adjusted their consciousness to a new economic exigencies, and the call for abolitionists, previously ignored and despised, found wide respectability. Even the noble efforts to suppress the slave trade were mainly a prelude, a justification to colonial conquest in Africa. Britain took the lead in the suppression of the slave trade, whereas other countries, particularly the United States, resisted such efforts for years. Significantly, however, the British Navy, which was to enforce the law of 1807, had two missions: to suppress the illegal trade of human cargo and to protect legitimate trade on in non-human commodities. The first mission of the suppressing and the legal trade marked the end of the era when millions of Africans were shipped abroad in bondage. The second mission of protecting, quote, legitimate trade entailed the opening of new markets of manufactured goods and new sources of raw materials, beginning in the era of colonialism, when the whole African continent became a huge labor camp. Wow, that's amazing. Not that it became a labor camp, but yeah. The historic greed for profit, the glory of conquest abroad, the wish to ensure internal peace by conquering enemies in distant lands, and the collective conceit to save heathens from hellfire. All these motivated and justified colonialism. Every Western European power, mighty and small, prepared for the assault on people of color. Each nation grabbed what colony it could and forced its subjects to foot the bill. Between 1850 and 1911, Europe scrambled for subjects and raw materials, brought almost the entire world under domination. In 1914, Britain boasted of an empire 140 times its size, Belgium 80 times, Holland 60 times, and France 20 times. This remarkable expansion of territories and the excuses of brutal might was to have not only catastrophic repercussions in economics and politics in the world, but also profound consequences for human psychology, and particularly the relationship between people of Europe descent and the rest of humanity. The violence of slavery is well known, but little appreciated is the striking continuity of slavery and colonialism, particularly in its pre-World War II variety. Each colonial power perfected its own style and system of exploitation. However, the effect on Africans was the same everywhere. In the French Congo, for instance, some 9 million Africans were coerced to undertake the extremely dangerous labor of gathering and preparing Indian rubber. Women and children were held in unsanitary and crowded hostage houses to compel relatives to work. In the Congo Free State, the kidnapping of women and children for ransom in rubber was so common that hostage houses became familiar and common institutions. Where rubber did not grow, inhabitants were forced to furnish food for soldiers and serve as carriers. Within 20 years, a population of nearly 30 million was reduced to about 9 million. Jesus Christ, that's a fucking lot of people. Similarly, the long railway, known as the Congo Ocean, stretched through the difficult equatorial terrain, was built by forced labor between 1921 and 1932. It required no less than 127,250 fit adult males, 138,125 years of absence from villages, and the minimum of 141,100 deaths for its completion. At about the same time, 42,000 Africans from the Ivory Coast were conscripted to build the railway linking at Abidjan and Ferkesending. I can't say it, sorry. While at least 16,000 others were put to work in transport and agriculture. The Italian fascist government, which ruled a portion of Somaliland, was also known for its practice of capturing thousands of, quote, contract workers, whom they put to hard labor or leased to private companies. The same practice was also common in the Portuguese colonies, particularly in Angola. And yet, if all such killing labor illustrates the greed and sadism of earlier generations, apartheid South Africa is today but a variable amalgam. Amalgam. I'm gonna make sure. I'm gonna see what that word is. I always have a problem with that word. Oh, I got my other thing. A-M-A-L-A. Well, not A, G-A-M. Did I not have you up? Come on. Up you go.
Amalgam.
Is an alloyed mixture of mercury with another metal tool. Okay. To pass cruelties of slavery and colonialism. One simply has to look at current practices in that country to observe in vivo the harrowing experience under slavery and colonialism, but with all the trappings and modernity, the essential complicity of such countries as Britain, France, and United States and Israel. With the demise of colonialism in most of Africa during the early 1960s, the era of neocolonialism was upon us. Today, neocolonialism exists side by side with autocolonialism, the highest stage of oppression, in which the victims actively participate in its own victimization. Besides Europe's unstable greed, I think so. I'm going to make sure that I don't know this word either.
Insatiable.
What?
Insatiable.
Insatiable greed to own and control three components of this historical oppression of black people by whites are worth emphasizing. The first is a class of men called factors during the slave trade. The second is the role of the alcohol and the fostering of self-destruction, homo consumen, among the oppressed. The third, and perhaps the most important, is the use of gunpowder for Europe's global pillage. Factors, alcohol, and gunpowder. Next one. The middlemen on the African coast who bought and delivered black people from the Atlantic voyage were called factors. They often represented large firms and sometimes dealt with any slaver who was willing to pay for human merchandises. Some of them were a degraded lot of European convicts, sadists, and fortune seekers. Their contemporary representatives are the white mercenaries today serving apartheid and the subversion of Zimbabwe for money. Others were Africans who adopted European manners and greed, capturing and selling any human beings for money. These African factors have since increased and found new disguises. In the plantations, they emerged as a, quote, house inward, attending to all the master's need and reporting on the field inwards. In colonial Africa, they appeared as domestic boys, quote unquote, petty civil servants, and agents of colonial administration. Conversions of Western education later became the effective tools for making and distinguishing a modern African factor. Today, factorship is a pervasive psychological phenomenon among black intelligentsias and many black leaders. The role of alcohol in slavery and colonialism requires great appreciation. The historical origins of alcohol and the use to which it was later put are significant. Although beer was made in Egypt around 3000 BC, the first steps of the distillation of strong spirits were developed by Arab alchemists around AD 800. Religious prohibition prevented them from taking the crucial steps to distill alcohol. Thus, we were content to distill perfume. Thus, they were content to distill perfume. The increase in the range of potency of alcohol content to distill perfumes. The increase of the range of potency of alcohol coincided with European conquest of the rest of the world. The first distillation of strong spirits was for medical purposes in the 12th century. During the 14th bubonic plague, called the Black Death, the demand for whiskey and brandy wine intensified. Alcohol of different varieties was soon produced in large quantities of Europe's conquest of other lands and psyches. As mentioned earlier, the introduction of alcohol to Native Americans hastened their subjugation and now sustains their victimization. It is remarkable how much land and lives have been lost for a few drinks. The Dutch bought Manhattan Island for 3 barrels of rum in 1826. Indeed, the name the islands means, quote, the place where we got drunk, end quote. Alcohol was also potent and effective tool in the Atlantic slave trade, a highly profitable commodity. It contributed significant capital to finance the Industrial Revolution. African dealers in the slave trade were often induced to drink, and while drunk, better bargains were struck. The dealers themselves were sometimes kidnapped. What is more, addiction to alcohol ensured numerous dependents, dealers willing to exchange anyone for a drink for a few drinks. Using alcohol primarily, American slave traders of the middle 18th century perfected the triangular trade. They used 3 commodities: rum, slaves, and molasses. They took rum from New England and exchanged it to Africa for slaves. They sold the slaves in the Caribbean and bought cheap molasses for their voyage back to New England. The molasses was distilled into more rum at home, and the rum was later used to buy more slaves in Africa. Much like the triangular trade of Liverpool, this exchange of 3 commodities brought enormous profits for white predators and more torment for black victims. In Europe, as in America, alcohol distillation brought about more industries and advances in chemistry. But for indigenous people, keep saying the other word, was well as people in African descent, alcohol consumption forced them into bondage, and today sustains their auto-destruction. Alcoholism is a major and pervasive problem among Black Americans as well is well known. Not only it is a significant health hazard for Black Americans, but also a sale and purchase of alcohol have an amazing ripple effect. The National Institution of Alcoholism and Alcohol Abuse estimates that Black Americans spent $6.5 billion on alcohol in 1947 to 1975 alone. The loss of sorely needed income is also concurrent with much suffering of alcoholics and their loved ones. Just as there is a chain of profiteers starting from the owners to the liquor store to the owners of the distilling industries, there is also a chain of victims for every alcoholic. Loved ones and community members pay an unmeasurable toll for every alcoholic in the community. For instance, more than 70% of murders use alcohol regularly. Alcohol consumption in the Black community reaches its peak on the weekends, and so do such violent crimes as homicide, suicide, spouse beating, and child abuse. Indeed, the alcohol blood level of the Black community is higher than when bargains are being struck long ago between slaves and dealers on the African coast. More specifically, today's soaring school alcohol blood levels in the Black community only hastens its auto-destruction. And this is all brought to you by white supremacy. Equally appalling to rate of alcoholism and alcohol-induced black on black, which is no crime in South Africa, which is not true. The relations between alcohol and oppression is here more blatant and more ominous. The racist government in South Africa hardly disguises how it uses alcohol for social control or for the subjugation of Black people. For instance, the West Rand Administration Board, charged within administrative control of Soweto, held a monopoly on all legal sales of alcohol in huge ownership townships. In Soweto alone, it used to sell 160 million barrels of beer annually. The blood and tears shed due to this level of induced and manipulated consumption are impossible to measure. The number of lives lost, homes broken up, psyches destroyed. These retell and same stories. These retell the same stories of an ordained autodestruction. The willful design of a racist government knows well the helplessness and painful withdrawal symptoms it can inflict on so many in the black community. Thus, the retaliation for the 1976 rebellion in Soweto, the government deliberately burned many beer halls and liquor stores. Wow, that's wild. They got them to be dependent on it purposely. Yet alcohol and the factor would not by themselves be sufficient to force slavery and subjugation on people without the power of deadly and superior arms. And every increasing sophistication of Euro-American weapon reflects an unwavering determination to perpetuate that historical rampage and the status quo of bondage. The development and use of gunpowder is itself revealing. Indeed, no invention has created as much havoc in the world as did the development and application of gunpowder. The Chinese first invented gunpowder, but they used it for only fireworks. Medieval Europe learned of it from Arab people. It is said that even in Europe, the introduction of gunpowder had the greatest impact politically, economically, and scientifically. Gunpowder and its earlier complements, the cannon and the musket, initiated a technical revolution in warfare and drastically changed the balance of power in the world. This new technology of death undermined the independence of the land-based European aristocracy and brought to ascendancy those who had access to the necessary technical skills and sources of metal. Meanwhile, the non-European majority of the world was being decimated and subdued with gunpowder. The African inability to develop gunpowder had a most devastating consequence. To be sure, Africans had long elaborated advanced cultures and fashioned huge empires like Ghana, Mali, and Songhay. The mining of gold, copper, and iron was known centuries before Europe unleashed its historical avarice. How you say that?
Avarice.
Thank you. Higher centers of learning, like the University of Sankore and Timbuktu, existed while Europe stagnated in the Dark Ages. Remarkable advances were also made in medicine, jurisprudence, and art. African craftsmen were in fact able to make muskets before and during the slave trade. But in spite of these advances, only few African societies had developed their own gunpowder. In a world made gruesome and cynical by Europe's violent onslaught, little wonder that some historians consider gunpowder, quote, the hallmark of an advanced culture. During the early phases of European encroachment, Africans fought the best they knew how, with whatever they could lay their hands on. This was not sufficient, however, and the continent was as easy prey to Europe's relentless rampage and violence. The effective defense against European predation was therefore impossible. In time, the noise of bondage became ever tighter and more suffocating. All defenses and human values were dislocated. Subsequently, there remained but two possibilities: slavery or collaboration. Europe's guns and gunpowder forced some into chattel slavery, others into sinister collaboration. The ethics of skinning others before being skinned spread like a contagion. Internecines wars became endemic. Guns and gunpowder, every more indispensable. Europe gained at once more slaves, more collaborators, and a market for its new technology of death. These gains reinforced each other and geometric proportions. So did the agony of bloodletting of Africa. During the 18th century, for instance, Birmingham guns and gunpowder were notorious in the slave trade. Birmingham was the center of gun manufacturing and trade for more than 2 centuries. There was in fact a common saying that, quote, the price of a black person was one Birmingham gun, end quote. Not only were Birmingham guns and gunpowder cherished by slave traders, but Africans were also importing them in huge quantities. Africa was indeed the most important consumer of Birmingham guns and gunpowder. It is estimated that African imports of Birmingham guns alone amounted to from 100,000 to 150,000 annually. Thus, Europe's new technology of death at once enslaved millions, forced others to degrading collaboration, and created a new market for profit. Birmingham guns and gunpowder were early harbingers of what was to follow on a global scale. The technology of death was now becoming more sophisticated and more destructive. It comes in all sizes, range, and efficiencies. It is made and sold by the West and by the East, which countries like Israel and Brazil profiting from the manufacture and auctioning of arms. Meanwhile, many African countries squandered more on foreign arms than their combined budgets for health and education. Internecine conflicts and war still raged as a fever for alien arms reaches reckless and maddening peaks. Wildly peaks. Sorely needed resources, human and material, are thereby wasted. Under the false and confused pretext of national security, the carnage within and without borders became more and more wanton. Heavily equipped African armies are today conquering none other than their own people. Avarice. All right, I'll go look at it. They must be doing something. I dropped and come back. Okay. I don't know how to say names.
Avarice.
Yeah, avarice, okay. Avarice and violent European outlash upon the rest of the world also came to haunt Europe. The dictum of that violence begat violence is nowhere better illustrated than in Europe's history. World War I was in fact more bitter and bloody than the 30 years war of the 17th century. A unprecedented number of European youth were hurling steels and explosive at one another, while others were dying of poison gas and rat-infested trenches. John Buchan, a British diplomat, commenting on World War I, wrote, "Everywhere in the world has heard the sounds of things breaking." 2 decades later, a more total and consuming fire engulfed Europe. World War II was an invariable demonstration of the civilization gone wild, as a high priest of science presided in concentration camps and gas chambers. Everywhere was heard the sounds of thinking breaking and agony of millions dying, maimed, or psychologically broken. World War II was both a tragic culmination and a clear warning to those who cuddle up to Europe. This war also marked a historical watershed in the awakening of people of color in Africa and Asia. Duped into defending the motherland, willy-nilly, dragged into Europe's bloodbath, people of color were able to scrutinize Europe more closely, its people's techniques in family quarrels, in battlefields in distant lands. People previously separated by geography and history also came in contact with one another and shared their common aspirations for freedom. As veterans of World War II returned to the colonies better and awakened, nationalism and their peoples will to freedom were rekindled. What happened in Hiroshima and why Japan was selected for that shameful experiment left little doubt that the civilization built on the toil and torment of others will readily explode its technology of G-side and do anything to ensure its supremacy. That today the United States and the Soviet Union specifically, the doormat of European strain in both countries, complete for world hegemony, does not change the historical rampage and self-aggrandizement of Europe. The superpower competition merely extends the historical violence to a colossal proportion. Korea, the Congo, Vietnam, and Afghanistan recall the same patterns of victimization, the same European greed to own and control at whatever cost. But when Africa or Asian leaders plead for more deadly arms from Washington or Moscow to reconquer only their own people, this indicates that factors come in many guises, and that factorship is today more insidious and pervasive than ever before. Slaves no longer have to be chained or transported in ships. They come on their own to Europe or America, possessed and compromised long before they had reached these shores. Haitian refugees pathetically show that the Middle Passage is still as real and harrowing as ever. These refugees, victims of factors at home and of racism abroad, embark on risky sea voyages, only to be herded to American prison camps and treated as criminals. The plight of African students in similar but more subtle. The master-slave dialect to date remains intact. Even the best in human advancements, such as the first heart transplant and the landing of men on the moon, portray the same pattern of exploitation and the same persistent wish for conquest. The first heart transplant was made by a white South African physician. Predictably, the unwilling donor was a person of color. The lucky beneficiary was an alien white South African, undocumented but not unreasonable to suspect is that many South African black people were exterminated with before their historical successful heart transplant. Similarly, the spirit and ambition of Columbus is now reaching outer space. The historical wish to own and control, relentless self-aggrandizement that disemboweled others and stripped them of their humanity is today seeking to conquer other planets. The same persistent motivation, also known, now threatens a nuclear holocaust, a total annihilation. Indeed, the greed that consumed other peoples and hoarded earthly resources may soon cannibalize itself before it has conquered outer space. Yet what have psychologists said and done about the historical rampage and potential self-annihilation? The heritage of psychology. So we went through the different factors, and that's pretty good. Like alcohol, people that were forced to comply, and then we talk about what was the third one? I forgot the other one. Gunpowder, and how that gave people military power, and how they kept it from other people. Okay, so now we're on a different topic. We're on the heritage of psychology. We went through the factors. The earliest roots of Euro-American psychology can be traced to Greek traditions and philosophy. Greek civilization laid the initial foundation for certain problems that persist in Euro-American psychology. The body-mind dualism, the nature-nurture debate, the individualistic orientation, and the fascination with numbers characterizing Euro-American psychology found early expression in Greek thought. Socrates and Plato sharpened the distinctions between soul and body, whereas Aristotle sought their unity. Pythagoras believed that the soul is at home with numbers. He argued that the world of beauty and of science were ordered mathematically. Hippocrates, I can't say his name, insisted that mental disorders were due to diseased brains. He also emphasized the importance of heredity and predispositions. Greek scholars often distinguish between nouns and psyches. Oh, nous, N-O-U-S, and psyche. The former meant mind. The later translated to spirit. Their concepts of mind emphasize that human capacity to receive expressions has done a blank wax table. Their notion of spirit stresses animating forces, movements, and particularly emotional experiences. The distinction between thought and feeling is as between her inherited attributes and environmental influence was since persisted in Western thought. This, with the demise of ancient Greek civilization, the church and its doctrines became dominant, promoting the view that the world is sick and sinful. It made guilt and re-institutions what's that? Oh, I gotta look at this word, everybody. R-E-S-T-I-T. There it is. Gotta hear it.
Restitution.
I was right. Restitutions. Common European preoccupations. What?
I just got back. Sorry, I had to go to the bathroom.
That's okay. The church also instigated the direct and bloody era of witch hunting and burning. Estimates are that between 1603 and 1626 alone, 250,000 persons were burned as witches in Europe. During these 25 years, there were respectively 70,000 to 100,000 persons burned in England and Germany. The emergence of consolidation of the bourgeoisie brought forth new social reforms and innovations in various fields. But this emergency and consolidation of the bourgeoisie also brought new problems in the relations of classes in Europe and of races abroad. The cult of reason justified supported the cult of profit. Speculation about human nature, the relations of mind and body, the debates about the differences between social class and race were given a new impetus. But by the discovery of the Americas, the infamy and guilt of slavery, the social culture, dislocation and industrialization, the mass migration of urban centers, and later by the impositions of colonial domination on people of color. The major thinkers who profoundly influenced the emergence and content of psychology often provided ample rationalizations for the exploitation of the lower classes in Europe and in the inferior races abroad. These earlier rationalizations and their stature and their proponents had in turn a formative impact on the future development of and amnesia of Euro-American psychology. Psychology was for a long time subsumed under philosophy, problems of ethics and nature of human emotions, the power of human will. These were some of the questions examined through introspection and erudition. By the late 19th century, psychology had developed a closer affinity for experimental psychology. Earlier experiments centered on psychology and biophysics. Sensation.
Physiology. It's talking about physiology. Sorry, you keep saying psychology when it says physiology. Sorry.
Okay, sensations, reaction time, and the function of the cortex were carefully scrutinized. These earlier experiments were mainly of academic interest. On a few occasions, however, some researchers ventured out of their laboratories into the real world, early studies like those of Cannabis in France anticipated what later was to become the hallmark of establishment psychology, namely the fetish of experimentation on narrow technical problems, even as the life and death of others is in the balance. Cannabis studied. Cannabis is not the actual. I think it's the person's name. Studied the process of consequences of executions by the guillotine. wondering if victims died speedily or painlessly. Following the observation of that Makreb practice, Canamus reasoned that the brain was not the region of direct assault. He concluded that death by guillotine was not painful, since only mechanical responses of lower reflexes followed execution. The beginning of the scientific psychology is by common consent dated at 1879, when William Wotton established his psychological laboratory in Lisbon, Germany. Wotton, WUNTD, emphasized the need to study psychological problems through psychological and experimental methods. This meant that a psychological experiment, to be genuinely scientific, must focus on the manipulation of measurable variables under stated conditions, and to find and the findings evaluated on the basis of empirical criteria. As Murphy and Kovacs pointed out, Wotton was so successful, quote, in turning psychology into a laboratory-based science, that since his time, all other aspects of psychology have suffered from feeling of second-class citizenships, end quote. By the time Watson came on the scene, experimental psychology had emerged from the shadows of experimental physiology. Watson neglected consciousness and subjective experiences. Thus, the testimony of human subjects came to lose credence, and experimentations on animals was seen to be more reliable and promising. As a focus shift to behavior and its quantification of the usefulness and concepts like mind and consciousness was doubted. Yet some of the old debates of psychology persisted. There is in psychology no debate as persistent and politically potent as the nature versus nurture. The debate has long permeated psychological literature. The nature versus nurture controversy is certainly far from an academic debate. Fundamental to it is the implicit question: what indeed must be done with the poor, the dispossessed, and those considered somehow, quote, deviant? More specifically, are these wretched being supplied the variable products of inferior heredity, or are they redeemable victims? Redeemable victims of a delirious environment. This is really the heart of the heated and persistent controversy, the technical jargon of the veiled terms in which discussions are often couched, only obscured and social political kernels of the controversy. And when the debate is stripped of its academic and scientific trappings, one finds much that is truly scandalous. Responses to the controversy have generally taken two classical forms. There are, on the one hand, those who argue for the primacy and heredited predisposition, and on the other, those who argue for the potency of environmental influences. Rarely does the theorist of either persuasion argue for one position to the exclusion of the other. It is rather a question of emphasis and the conclusion thereby drawn. There has recently been disillusionment with the debate and efforts made for the interactionist perspective. Through the centuries, the debate has been waxing and waning. Periods of social upheaval and agitation for reform bring the debate to prominence in the psychological literature. Gosh, I keep burping. What is more, the position in any period often reflects the predatory or reformist mode in the ruling class. The list of academic stature of supporters for the nature position in the debate are indeed impressive. More so when the debate concerns people of color. Thomas Malthus, David Hume, Robert Spencer, Francis Galton, Carl Pearson, G. Stanley Hall, Louis Terman, Cyril Burt, to name only a few, had each taking a dim and disparaging view of the poor and the dispossessed. Each of them justified oppression. Attempts to refute the justification appeared as difficult as dismantling the objective conditions of oppression. The ideas of these men of great stature also became the rallying doctrines of hateful bigots and calculating beneficiaries of an oppressive status quo. One of the earliest and most influential of these was Thomas Malthus, who believed that any reform to improve the lot of the poor was not only unpatriotic, but also against the law of God and nature. In his view, the diseases and death of the poor were not to be prevented, but actively sought. Thus, his famous essay on the principles of population, Malthus wrote, I don't like this fucker. If we dread the too infrequent visitations of the horrid form of famine, we should sedulously encourage other forms of destruction. Instead of recommending cleanliness to the poor, we should encourage contrary habits. In our town, we should make the streets narrower, crowd more people into the houses, and court the return of the plague. What the fuck? This dude's like, just get rid of the poor. Jesus Christ. Could you imagine like seeking psychological help in these times right now? I mean, it's bad in this time, but can you imagine back then? Jesus Christ. You're poor? No. This is your plot in life. Sorry. Nothing we can do. Like, what the fuck? If Malthus opposed all reforms for the dispossessed in Europe, David Hume justified slavery and the subjugation of black people. His stature as a scholar and a careful observer made him one of the most formidable spokesmen of the view of black people are inherently inferior to whites. Hume argued that black people, and in general, all other species of men, to be naturally inferior to whites. Jesus Christ, fuck you, dude. Such sweeping generalizations by the pioneering empiricists show that for a bigot, racism supersedes any evidence of or scientific observation. Oh my gosh, who's this? Anti-racist and abolitionists had first to struggle against the authority and influence of Hume, his ideas and statures. It is now heard to be appreciated the difficulties this entailed, and to realize the impact of Hume's racism had on other thinkers. Influenced by Hume's idea, Kant commented thus about a man of color, quote, "This fellow was quite black from head to toe, a clear proof that what he said was unintelligent." Fuck you. The theory of natural selection Malthus formulated and Darwin's established was soon extended to social, moral, and political debates. Spencer interpreted society and psychology in terms of a struggle for survival and the survival of the fittest. Jesus Christ, he's a Darwinist. His pronouncement of the social Darwinism he espoused were quickly embraced to forestall social reforms in Europe and America. Spencer himself opposed such basic reforms as universal education, minimum standards of health or occupation, safety, improved sanitary conditions, and the establishment of trade unions. Not surprisingly, affluent and commercial tycoons found Spencer's idea most congenial. American Andrew Carnegie wrote that he, quote, found the truth of evolution in Spencer's writing. John D. Rockefeller asserted that, quote, the growth of large businesses is merely a survival of the fittest, merely the working out of the law of nature and the law of God. To impose Spencer's social Darwinism was not only to refute assertions of such powerful tycoons, or to challenge Spencer's personal influence. It was also to contradict evolutionary theory itself. Here was one clear instance where capitalists and scholars combined forces to powerfully defend the status quo. Equally formidable, but with more enduring consequences for psychology is the work of Francis Galton, a cousin of Darwin and a heir to a handsome fortune. He dedicate after the publication of The Origins of the Species, Galton published his Hereditary Genesis, in which he argued that individual greatness is inherited and runs in well-to-do families. Galton was a father of eugenics and what's this word? Do you know this word? We're gonna look it up anyways, because I don't know what it means.
Yeah, look up what it means, but it's psychometric.
Psychometrics? I wonder if it's probably a measurement, like a measurement. Because it says psychometrics, I'm guessing. Psychometrics is a scientific field concerning with the objective measurement of psychology attributes such as intelligence, personal traits, and cognitive. That's what he used in eugenics and psychometric traditions was in psychology. Not only, we still use that today. Not only did he pioneer the studies of individual differences and a quantitative method in psychology, two central features of Euro-American psychology. He also pioneered the pseudo-scientific classification of the human race into various levels of superiority and worth. Galton viewed the nature versus nurture question as a practical social problem for which his eugenics movement provided an effective solution to the elimination of the unfit. Galton's delusion regarded the menace of racial pollution, rapidly caught on the latter formed the intellectual edifice for Nazi propaganda and G-side. It was also the impetus and justification for numerous legislations on the compulsory sterilization of poor and oppressed in America. The eugenics movement of Galton pioneered has since developed into a highly influential force with sinister aims and programs. Gee, I wonder if we have anybody in the government that's a eugenics. Huh? Do we? Jeez. The power of the stature of those it counts in its ranks is indeed disquieting. For instance, the first International Congress of Eugenics, held in the University of London, was chaired by a son of Charles Darwin and attended by such notables as Winston Churchill, Alexander Graham Bell, Charles E. Eliot, who was president, emeritus of Howard University, David Starr Jordan, then president of Stanford University, and Guilford Pinnock, a future governor of Pennsylvania. The Second International Congress of Eugenics was held in New York, 1921. Hoover and Secretary of Commerce, the president of Clark University and of Smith College were listed among the sponsoring committee of this Congress. The repeated call for forced sterilization for the poor and the downtrodden reached its climax during the Third International Congress of Eugenics held in New York in 1932, the third year of the Great Depression. In all seriousness, Theodore R. Roosevelt presented the following solution for what he saw was amiss in America: the forced sterilization of about at least 14 million citizens who had low, we're going to use it, IQ scores since World War I. The development of use of intelligence tests gradually give psychology a new professional identity, a modicum of scientific respectability, and a lucrative social function. Most remarkable in the history of testing is the immense gains psychology derived from the twin pestilence of war and bigotry. World War I and World War II brought psychology out of its academic ivory tower. World War I enlisted the services of psychologists for the classification and screening of recruits in the armed forces. Following the war and unprecedented and hectic pace of psychological testings exploded in schools and societies. Was it psychological? Is that psychological? Yeah, psychological testing. Okay, cool, I got it. Thank you. Psychological testing in Europe and European immigrants, and the deportation of thousands, presumably for low IQ scores, gave psychologists new powers and functions of gatekeeper. World War II saw at least 1,500 American psychologists in the armed services. In addition to testing recruits, psychologists took on increasing psychotherapeutic roles in order to return as many men as possible to combat. The discipline of psychology, its theories, methods, and instruments subsequently blossom. Its students increase exponentially, and public stature of psychology also grew. New and seemingly inexhaustible sources of funding, both private and governmental, became increasingly accessible for research and training. Jesus Christ. That is wild. So now we know where eugenics comes from and why, and what they utilized it for, and why they had people. So it's just like, instead of like returning the worker back to work, they're returning the soldier back to war. Like, here's some coping mechanisms. Now, I think this is white Anglo-Saxon people, so I think they're meaning WASP in that sense, and Jewish trends in psychology.
White Anglo-Saxon Protestant.
Yeah. So that's what a WASP is. Yes. Let's see how long we have, because we have like 15 minutes. Let me look. Can you remind me on 68? I just want to look ahead. I'm going to add a bookmark anyways. But just in case. Okay, we'll read the rest of this and then we'll be done. 68. Oh, what did I say? 68. Yeah. So we'll end this chapter. All right, 68, everybody. All right, let's go. The combined services of testing of psychotherapy ushered psychology into a public, lucrative arena in which the academic psychology of the past was unaccustomed. These two professional activities, two social functions, and two ways of earning a living had different origins and inspirations before they became alloyed into Euro-American psychology. The psychometric tradition had been pioneered and inspired by Galton and his eugenics movements. Permeating these traditions was WASP bigotry, delusions of Anglo-Saxon superiority, and a determined wish to keep people of color under subjugation or even eliminate other species of humanity. Galton and his students, Karl Pearson, introduced a method of the mathematics for their scientific racism. The development and use of intelligence testings also provided a potent tool for assessing the worth of others according to birth and what they have. Those who were not either WASPs or rich were doomed to the category of the unfit and risked sterilization. It was in 1890 the Cattell introduced the notion of mental tests. In 1916, Bennett and Simon published their test based on a wider sample of behavior. Henry Goddard, an errant disciple of Galton, introduced Bennett's test to America, but it was Terman's revision of the Bennett scale, who widely known for the Stanford Bennett intelligence skill that was destined to have a profound influence. Louis Terman, it would be noted, was also a firm believer in the Galtonian delusion. He was convinced that Spanish indigenous people, Mexicans, and black people have genetically inferior intelligence. Quote, the child of this group, end quote, wrote Terman, quote, should be segregated in special classes and given instruction which is concrete and practical, end quote. This manner and content of education were to prepare them for the manual and menial jobs that they were presumably suited to by nature. As for their parents, Terman argued that, quote, from the eugenic point of view, they constitute a grave problem because of their usually prolific breeding, end quote. His recommendations, like those of other eugenicists, was of course sterilization, increasingly while insisting on such brutal pessimism about the living majority. Terman and his associates invoked the dead from their tombs and estimated the IQ of such great men of Beethoven, Darwin, Napoleon, and Lincoln. Of all the I can't say the damn word. Illustrious.
Yep. Thank
The
you.
illustrious dead, whose intelligence was assessed. Galton's IQ predictably soared highest and was most impressive. According to Terman, and associates, Galton's IQ approach, unquestionably in the neighborhood of 200, a figure not equaled by more than one child in 50,000. In the general population, such wild reveries and eugenics ranting may now be seen for what they actually are. But these conclusions were not donned by obscured and isolated men. Terman was by then president of the American Psychological Associations. Similarly, G. Stanley Hall, the teacher and mentor of both Gardner and Terman, was twice president of that association. These pioneers and countless others who followed in their footsteps left Euro-American psychology in a significant heritage that only a massive amnesia could repress. Actually, it is not only that the racism and influence of these men that are conveniently repressed. Hardly explored are the remarkable social network binding such racist psychologists into a powerful force and a dishonest expedience, with which they furthered bigotry. For instance, Sir Cyril Burt, who died in 1971, was the most prominent psychologist in Britain for over half a century. His prolific writing and twin studies showing a primacy and heredity over the environment were for years unassailable. The precision and consistency of his findings were impeccable, to the chagrin of those who disagree with his conclusions. Jensen and Shockley, two contemporary adherents of the Galtian delusion, relied exorbitantly on Burt's twin studies to bolster their racist contentions. Yet we now know that Cyril Burt simply fabricated much of his data. Interesting, Jensen was not only a close friend of Burt, but he was also one of the last to visit Burt before his death. Burt himself grew up in a neighborhood of the illustrious Francis Galton. Burt knew Galton personally and remained enchanted by his bigotry for the rest of his life. In short, those who argued for the primacy of genetic biological factors in the nature-nurture debate are tightly knit and inbred. They are more adherent, more unyielding, and more organized than the so-called nurture proponent. They have the tycoons, their capital, the state violence and sympathies and complicity of their sinister aims. They impose social reforms and defend social inequity as the natural order of life. They attribute inherent immutable deficiencies to the poor and the dispossessed. A corollary to this conviction is their implicit suggestions that the well-to-do in society deserves the wealth and power they have because of better genes and superior heredity. Their impact on psychology is formidable. They define psychology's topical properties, pioneered many of these methods, and formed the intellectual edifice upon which much Euro-American psychology was founded. Leading scholars in their days, they played key roles in professional organization and established some of the most prestigious journals of psychology. Adamant, cohesive, and expedient, they brought to bear their influential works and personal reputation to forestall new reforms and thwart hard-won legislations for the poor, the disabled, and the different. In the research and practice, they defended bigotry and went to any length to concoct convincing data. Opposing these nature proponents are the less cohesive, less informed, and more relenting nurture proponents. The latter do not, of course, deny the importance of genes and heredity. What they reject is the view that these are distributed according to social and racial patterns. But beyond some general assertions, the nurture proponent holds contradictory opinions of what, of anything, must be done to change the plight of the poor and the oppressed. The majority of them, although tolerant of differences in their outlook, take a laissez-faire approach in practice. Others among them, although arguing for the potency of the environment, however, manage to blame the victim as they invoke deficient and pathological models. Even their central concepts of environment is ambiguous. What they all share is the view that the environment, defined broadly to include, oh my gosh, I got a warning, to include anything external to the person, is the most crucial determinant of human psychology. But beyond this general agreement, the nurture proponent within establishment psychology are plagued with ambivalence, indecisions, paternalism, and even veiled racism. They shift with the political mood of the time, and they adjust their scholarship to the requirements of funding agencies. Their characteristic propensities and their laissez-faire approach to practice make them, at best, unreliable allies for, quote, the wretched of the earth, end quote. In the psychometric traditions, in psychology is found on Galtonian and wasp bigotry. Psychotherapy was, as we know it today in Euro-American development, from two trends of establishment psychology. The first is the dynamic traditions, and the second is the behavioral perspective. The first owes much of the genius and charisma of its founder, Sigmund Freud, an assimilated Jewish person who personally knew the anguish and bigotry, minority status, and social exclusion. He had experienced enough to give him the impulses and pains of a victim, a history of anti-Semitism, and his struggle with the compact majority gave him and his people a moral edge over others, a critical skepticism of the prevailing ethos, and the uncanny skills of transformed subjective experiences in order to assimilate into the dominant social order. Thus, the most important and most arduous therapy that Freud was to undertake was that of himself. He is said to have once remarked his his doctor and friend, that, quote, the main patient who keeps me busy is myself, Oh, more burping. There are ample indicators that Freud's personal anguish and self-doubts had much to do with his being a Jewish person and racist Europe. Not like Fanon, his personal suffering and victim complex provided the stimulus for creative thought. The experience of victimization and oppression produced on the one hand tendencies towards rebellion and on the other tendencies towards and accommodation. Often the two tendencies coexist among the oppressed, although the predominant orientation can be identified for any persons or generations at a given time. Unlike Marx and Fanon, Freud's orientation to the status quo of oppression was essentially assimilationist. Moreover, the heteronotic. Heteronic? How do you say that word? We're gonna look up that word, everybody. We're almost done.
I don't know.
Hermeneutic. Not U-T-I-C. Hermeneutics, a branch of knowledge that deals with interpretations, especially the methodologies and principles used to understand written text, human actions, and communication. Hermeneutics approach to the psyche Freud pioneered is partly Jewish in origin, but it also derives from the experience of victims in an oppressive social structure they believe immutable. From this approach, one can best understand the change of subjective domains so as to better apt to and assimilate in the dominant status quo. Thus, although the WASP trend in psychology emphasizes bigotry and active intrusion in the lives of others, preferring empiricism and control, of external objects, the Jewish trend pioneered by Freud opts for the introspective approach and emphasizes the need to come to terms with oneself, a self historically tormented by a formidable and oppressive social structure. Freud's modest beginnings and minor status in the dominant society became less significant as his pioneering efforts were crowned with success. As Freud acquired a reputation and won numerous disciplines, attenuated his victim's impulse. His class identity became entrenched as his cherished goals of assimilation into the bourgeoisie was realized. His epic-making attack on sexual repression persisted, but his ideas remained steeped in the middle-class European outlook. This bourgeois European outlook, reinforced by the complaints of class background and his patience, had a decisive effect on the theory and practice Freud elaborated. The desires to win scientific respectability in the Darwin sense also diluted his social critique. Psychoanalytic theory deflected from this radical critique as it moved into the realm of animal instincts and the myth making was more the introduction of popularization of psychoanalysis and American accentuated latent problematics and added new limitations. Psychoanalysis gradually became the expensive venture, a middle-class luxury, a lucrative career, a commodity for profit. The critical edge that renders it an epic making was further blunted, and it came to idolize more adjustment. It blamed the victim of oppression and took the status quo off the hook. Today, psychoanalysis serves as a rationalizing bulwark to oppression. In fact, not unrelated to change in the wealth and status of the Jewish community in the United States. Behavioralist perspective was a later comer in the practice of therapy. It had diverse origins and influences. Major contributors to it included a Russian, a white South African, and two Americans. Ivan P. Pavlova first demonstrated what has come to be known as classical conditioning. John B. Watson coined the term behavioralism and limited himself to observable behaviors. But the two leading figures who had the most impact on behavioralist therapy was Burrhus F. Skinner, an American from the conservative Republican background, and Joseph Wolf, a white South African reared as an Orthodox Jewish person. The behavioral approach to therapy became a major force in the remarkable short time. Its simplicity and efficiency appeals to the technocratically consciousness. The relative ease with which its behavioral technology can be taught and practiced is invaded by competitors for the same clientele, namely patients who can pay and those who wield power in society. Actual behavioralism represents a synthesis of two major trends in psychology. It manipulates objective variables and affects individual adjustments to the status quo. A fundamental problem in the behavioralist perspective is that its central concept of behavior control and environment are devoid of social, political, and indeed human content. Knowledge gained from experimental rats and pigeons is extrapolated to human experience. Behavior is reduced to a specific measurable response within a specific time. Thus, it is stripped of attentionality and meaning. How such narrow definitions can explain the psychology of, say, human labor and its social character is never stated. Control is similarly reduced to simply what precedes or follows a given behavior. It is confined only to the immediate, the measurable, the quantifiable. Systematic power and social control therefore become too complex and irrelevant for such paradigm. Forgotten is also that the violence of racism is often more pernicious when covert than overt, and then overt. That what is more questions like who controls whom, for what end, are ignored. As, oh my gosh, Misler aptly points out, such questions are invaded with a retort that, quote, all control is reciprocal. Thus, according to Skinner, even, quote, the slave controls the slave owners, and by implications, neither bear responsibility for that state of affairs. Wow, that's wild. Similarly, the behavioralists use the environment as lost in its human meanings and content. The experimental maze becomes an analog. And with rats or pigeons, the experimenter attempts to manipulate people according to his or her wishes or whims. More commonly, people are portrayed as passive objects or a blank slate, a tabula rasa, able to receive impressions only from without. Forgotten is the fact that people are not only objects, but also subjects of history. It is they who transform the world and are in turn transformed by it. The naive materialism permeating the behavioralist perspective readily accommodate a history in which people are treated as objects. The Skinner and Whoopi emphasize not that a given environment or set of controls are oppressive, but that it can and should be made more effective. Jesus Christ. The net result of this argument and practice is only this: more effective power for the powerful and more effective control over the powerless. And when the question of values and ethics are posed, their answer is that such queries are irrelevant. This recalls the argument of Wernher von Braun, a German rocket engineer. My rockets just go up. Who cares where they come down? End quote. Actually, the use of psychology for warfare is a thriving but little known specialty. The abortive Project Camelot was a U.S. Army project concerning with counterinsurgencies and counter-revolutions in the developing world. The Army facts sheets indicates its its precise purpose as, quote, a basic social science project on precondition of internal conflicts and on effects of indigenous governmental actions on these preconditions. The operating budget of the project was at least 6 million. Today, sea lions, porpoises, and killer whales are trained for naval warfare. Even the innocent pigeon was drafted for the historical rampage. Project Pigeons was developed during World War II, when guidance systems for missiles were very rudimentary. If pigeons could play table tennis, they could also be trained to guide a missile. Skinner therefore devised a system in which pigeons pecked at a symbol as long as the missile remained on course. When the missile moved off course, the symbol moved left or right, and so did the pigeon, pecking to return the missile on course. Quote, by using certain schedules and reinforcements, Skinner could guarantee these pigeons would go on pecking until they dropped dead. Various tests showed this was a practical scheme. Project Pigeon, however, was abandoned in favor of the development of the atom bomb. When the Manhattan Project got going, the Pigeons missiles were grounded. Real quick, I think, is this okay? One more page, everybody. Skinner was openly disappointed, but his ingenuity had sparked hectic experimentations on psychological warfare. During the Vietnam War, pigeons were trained for equal lethal assignments. What the Soviets had thus far done with pavilion conditioning of Skinnerian reinforcement remained a mystery. In short, the world is still reeling from the historical adverse and violence Europe unleashed upon it. The global hemorrhage is by no means due to a curse, an accident, or a death instinct. Its genesis is traceable to the specific regions of the world, to a specific era, to definable historical circumstances. Europe's greed to own and control has had a profound impact on human history and psyche. Because of it, the world is made grim by wars for profit and power. People of all color and hues have lost their innocence. They will too reach out and touch the other in good faith, as long been overcome by a consuming desire for ownership and self-aggrandizement. Profit, gunpowder, alcohol, slave factors, these have left behind a violent legacy to the world. No people and no psyche remain untarnished. Even the pigeons and the porpoises are enlisted in these wars for profit and power. Oppression is everywhere, and so is the technology of death. As subsequent chapters demonstrate, the oppressed are still chained, physically here, socially there, and psychologically everywhere. The oppressor too remains adamant. He is in no mood for reconciliation. He has no wish for atonement, nor is he willing to turn over a new leaf. But he knows the gravity of his own crimes. Ruthless and hypervigilant, he gropes for inner security and peace through a more advanced technology of death. Indeed, oppression has now become so much a part of the world, so sedimented in human psyche, that the distinction between the oppressed and the oppressors is sometimes blurred. The oppressed is willy-nilly forced to be an oppressor, to himself, to his loved ones, to his neighbors. The appalling rates of alcoholism, child abuse, homicides, tyranny in oppressed communities are best understood in these terms. The original and stubborn oppressors, too, is oppressed, but by his own greed, violence, and fear of reprisal. How else can we make sense of today's incredible arms race? The technology of death has so advanced that all humanity could perish with the slightest provocation and misjudgment of one superior superpower, or Or as with wildness, can we really make sense out of the irrational? The specialist whose profession is to make sense out of this wildness and healing psychic wounds are themselves enmeshed in the historical rampage of violence of Euro-American psychology itself is now a variable arsenal. Those who profess and practice it are waging wars within wars, even when the immediate victims is a child whose IQ is being tested. There is a culture of silence on the European violence and a convenient amnesia among the establishment psychologists. Writers of history of psychology, too, remain fettered by the same traditions and selective inattention. Europe's violent assault within and without its borders are sloughed off as if they were existed or mattered. As if they never existed or mattered, sorry. Conveniently omitted also are the bigotry and complicities of major pioneers who defined the priorities, content, and methods of establishment psychology. History and ideas are thereby sanitized. Psychological theories shorn and their relations to oppressions are cataloged. Technical innovations for the economic inequities, and politics of domination are brandished. And in the end, the amnesia of the expert fosters more amnesia in the neophyte. Meanwhile, the oppressed and the oppressors alike court autodestruction, each according to his style and means. Fanon broke with this culture of silence and the amnesia of establishment psychology. As we shall see in the subsequent chapters, his insights in the psychology of oppression open view Vesta and present exciting challenges. And that's the end. And now we're going to be on we're on 2, psychology, medicines, and domination. And we're going to start, that's unit 2. We're on chapter 4, Fanon and Eurocentric psychology. That's where we'll end, and we're ending on 78.
All right. Hello.
Hello.
So, the amnesia, they say about the amnesia, about the IQ and the knowing that it involved the punishment and the what's it called when sterilization.
Yeah.
I don't think white people have amnesia of that. I think white people remember that quite clearly, and that's why they're using the R slur again. That's why they're asking, what's your IQ? Or my IQ's higher. I think because they do remember the history, and that they want that to happen to people.
They're using it as a metaphor because they don't talk about, like they just said, Fanon brought out all those things that they were just saying, oh, this is it, this is this. They're just pushing it off. So they're talking about the amnesia of these people that created those things, and that they're not highly documented. They're pushed aside as if something that is part of the thing. That's the amnesia that he's talking about.
Oh, that's not what I got. I'm sorry.
No, it's fine, but that's the amnesia that he's talking about. Because I agree with you. We know these things, we see these things, but they're brought to us as a normal function of psychology. They knew what was going on, right? They knew it.
Right, that's what I'm saying. They still know.
Yes, but they push it aside as if they have amnesia to not bring those into light. That's why they said at the end of the chapter that Fanon gets out of the amnesia stage and actually brings it to light.
Right, but no one, it's very rare to find a Fanonist therapist.
Yeah, I know it is. But that's the amnesia they're talking about. Those things that they bought in. We know, we see it. We're not amnesia from it because it happens to us. Mm-hmm. I mean, but there's some people that think that it's fine because it's just therapy. You know what I mean? But we know. Mm-hmm. Because we've dived into these things, but other people don't know. And it goes along to say that when they were trying to put soldiers back into the war, it goes along the line that all they're trying to do is put the working man back to work.
Yeah.
And it's still kind of that way too, because how can you deliver me from my abuse when you put me back into an abusive society?
Yeah, that's what I was saying. Is it's still exactly that way? I don't think there's an amnesia because I don't think we ever stopped doing it.
No, it's not the fact that they stopped doing it. It's the fact that they push it aside and cover it up. That's the amnesia he's talking about.
Okay.
Yeah. So. All right. Is there anything else?
Okay. Nope, that was it.
Okay. I'm looking forward to reading the next thing, and it's really showing us how psychology played a role in like colonialism, racism, and bigotry, and making the poor not making the poor no more again by sterilizing them, by keeping them from giving birth to other babies that are in the poor. They didn't take into consideration that it's social relations that causes these things. You know, that social relations and environment are causing these things. Because we are materialists. We know that that's the cause. That causes the condition. So, anything else before I close it? Okay, I will close it out.